I'd like to introduce our interviewers, who lots of you know from Faith Matters, Aubrey and Tim Chaves. So happy to have them here today. Tim and Aubrey grew up near Salt Lake City and went both to high school and middle school together. Tim served a mission in Montevideo, Uruguay, before earning his undergrad from BYU and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He's now an entrepreneur. Aubrey studied elementary education at Utah State and taught fourth grade before starting a cake decorating business. The word cake does not actually describe completely what she creates. You kind of need to see them. There may be a museum someday, I'm just saying. They're the parents of 4 children and serve on the executive board of Faith Matters Foundation. As co-hosts of the Faith Matters podcast, Aubrey and Tim are passionate about creating honest, expansive, and thoughtful conversations around faith. Their LGBTQ allyship is at the heart of their commitment to cultivating spaces of deeper understanding, belonging, and love in their community. They're great interviewers. They're always so prepared. And what I love most of all, which I think is one of the secrets of doing a good interview, is that you love the person that you're interviewing. You feel something for them. I feel that from you with the people you speak to, the respect you have for them. Our guest, who we're so lucky to hear from, is Bishop Karen P. Oliveto. She has the distinction of being the first openly LGBTQ bishop in the United Methodist Church. She and her wife, Robin Reidenauer, a nurse anesthetist and United Methodist deaconess, met in junior high church camp and have been together for 25 years. Go ahead. They were married in 2014. She was consecrated as a bishop of the United Methodist Church on July 16th, 2016 in Scottsdale, Arizona, and served the Mountain Sky Episcopal area, which includes congregations in Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and a small section of Idaho from 2016 to 2024, and retired on August 31st of 2024. Her full bio, because it's so extensive, you can find on the Gather page. I'm just pulling out another highlight or two. She was named by NBC as one of 30 contemporary LGBTQ change makers as part of their Pride 50 series. And she's the co-author of Talking About Homosexuality, a congregational resource, and the author of Our Strangely Warmed Hearts, Coming Out into God's Call, and also Together at the Table, Diversity Without Division in the United Methodist Church. I would like you to please welcome Aubrey and Tim Chaves and Bishop Karen P. Oliveto to the stage.
Yeah, let's do this.
Let's do it.
All right, we're on. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. We are so honored to get to have a conversation with you. I feel like we've been tutored by you all summer as we've gotten to know your work, and I just am so inspired by your warmth and your courage, and we really are excited to get to follow up and ask you all of the questions we've been thinking about this summer. So I would love for you to start for the audience. You wrote this book, Together at the Table, and you write really beautifully about your experience growing up at your literal dining room table with your big extended family. And I would love for you to just frame this entire conversation with a picture of what that was like for you growing up.
Well, the dinner hour was really important in our family. My mother was a single mom. We didn't have a lot of money, so she worked hard. I was the oldest of 3 girls, and her rule was you will be at dinner. And as kids, we were out playing, right, until she would mix up all our names, screaming outside of the kitchen door. And the wonderful thing about my mother, she never called us away from our friends. Whoever we were playing with were invited to eat with us. So our table might have been the 4 of us, but it was often 6, 8, 12. And I love that there was always enough. And so that taught me a whole lot. And then my father's family were Italian. And so that meant meals when we visited Grandma Oliveto. It was a 5-hour affair. And we would, and then we'd have salad, and then Grandma would bring out the roast. And by the time dessert came, we kids were under the table while all the men were smoking cigars. And there would be arguments and bitter, difference of opinion, but you always knew they loved one another. And we always left enfolded in that love. And so that also, what I learned was we eat with people we love. And that to me is what communion is. We eat with people we love.
Yeah. Thank you, Bishop Karen. And I want to echo Aubrey and just say thank you for what we've already learned from you, and thank you for being here. I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about your early faith life, especially sort of once your sexual identity became clearer to you, and any reconciliation that you felt like you needed to go through as a person of faith.
Sure. I can't talk about that without talking about my call to ministry. I fell in love with God and with Jesus and experienced the Holy Spirit at a young age. I had my call to ministry at 11. And so from that age, I grew up in a church that invested in its young people. My call was encouraged. I was given all sorts of leadership opportunities. And so by the time I got to seminary, I had this identity as pastor. But when I got to seminary, there was something I knew I was trying to ignore my whole life. And I recognized it in the stories of my gay and lesbian fellow students at seminary. Their stories sounded a lot like my story. And that first year, was the first time God was silent in my life as I struggled with my sexual orientation. And after my first year of seminary, I literally ran away. I hopped a bus in Oakland, California, and took it as far as you can in North America to my grandparents in Nova Scotia. And I read the Bible and cried and cried and cried. And literally in Utah, my tears spent, I was able to say I'm a lesbian. And I experienced that peace which passes all understanding. And God was back in my life. And I recognized that God never leaves us. We leave God when we aren't growing into the people God wants us to be. So I had always known that the community that had nurtured my faith let me know that God loved me unconditionally. Suddenly, though, the church, the denomination became conditional because we had a rule, again, we said that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. But I knew that God still called me. Jesus still wanted me to be a United Methodist pastor. And with that assurance, I just kept moving forward in the process, knowing that the door could shut at any time. But I had to live with that tension.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question
Sure.
really quickly? I'm curious about that, more about that time where you experienced God as being silent. And you mentioned that it's not God necessarily leaving us, but we tend to leave God. I'm curious though, for people that feel like they're trying so hard to live into who God intends them to be, but they continue to sort of live in that dark night of the soul for an extended period where God does seem silent. How do you, I have to imagine you've counseled many people in that situation over the years. What
Well, and I think it has to do with the shame that we carry, right? The world tells us, no, you can't be queer. That's evil, it's sinful, it's disgusting. And that causes many to carry deep shame. Well, God doesn't desire us to live in shame. And to just allow ourselves to sit in the light of God, to let that light enfold us, to feel the love that permeates in that love, I think is critical so that we can be who we are without shame.
There's something you write about that I thought was so interesting, and I care so much about this idea of certainty and uncertainty and what that looks like in the context of faith. And there's this line in the book where you say you talk about how you are always challenging yourself to ask, in what way is my certainty becoming a barrier to faith? I loved that idea that, like, for me, for so long, I was afraid that my uncertainty was breaking my faith. Like, the uncertainty was the thing that made me feel like maybe I'm not okay here, like maybe I'm missing something, or like I'm not living in a way that makes me worthy of knowing these things for sure, and knowing that God is waiting in the wings or no, it was the uncertainty that felt like such a problem. And so I was so interested in this idea that actually you see ways that certainty has been a barrier. So tell us about that.
Because the Holy Spirit keeps breaking in our life, right? God keeps this grace keeps pulling us into a fuller life than we're experiencing now. And when I think I'm certain, that's when I close myself off from that life. And so it's in the uncertainty that I have the greatest chance to grow more fully into it. Yeah. And I always ask myself, what if I'm wrong? What if, and I really had to ask that with the United Methodist Church. What if at the time, we only became inclusive in 2024. I faced countless complaints from my ministry and other things. But what if the church was right about homosexuality? But then I said, and what if I'm wrong? But am I helping people experience God's love by saying the rules are wrong? If I'm helping people experience God's love, then that's a certainty that's good.
Okay, so this kind of brings me to the next big question that I have for you. So you write about, in your ministry, you go and you visit every single congregation in your entire region, which I understand included Utah and all of the Western states, and never really knew what to expect. In fact, I think there were years that you actually had a bodyguard accompanied you, right? Like it was sometimes a hostile, small community, and you just never knew what you were getting into. And you write about, you see that and I would love for you can say the prayer because it is so beautiful in your words, but you write about this idea of walking into these spaces with an undefended heart. Right. And I felt myself really tighten up about that, because I feel like, no, go and defend, bring your bodyguard. Yeah, yes, yeah. And I think especially in a place that feels so vulnerable because it's where you're coming for spiritual nourishment, it feels like that wound, like the potential for a wound can be so deep, and I think even actually traumatizing. And so how do you think about both of those things? Like, what does an undefended heart mean to you, and how do you actually protect your soul?
Wonderful question. So when I was elected in 2016, it was clearly against the rules of the church, but the delegates, clergy and lay, saw in me a call to the episcopacy. And I was elected unanimously. Well, that rippled through the entire denomination and beyond the denomination, and especially alt-right groups and white supremacist groups started to attack me. And that's when I needed a bodyguard. But I was assigned to a place that didn't know me. They knew that, oh my gosh, we have this married lesbian bishop. Those things are like such cognitive dissonance. We don't think that should happen, and it's a gun-happy place. And I never knew. I knew I had to go visit these churches, every single one, and be there. And my spouse, who was a nurse anesthetist, and Tom, I had to take speech therapy to get that down. So, she retired because we knew we had to do this together as family. We had to shift, because marriage equality had only happened in 2015. So most of these towns they didn't know there were gay people in their town. They certainly didn't know married gay or lesbian people. And so I knew I had to visit and hear from them and let them, I call it my ministry of vomit, like, okay, get it out. I'm here, I can take it. But I didn't know how I would be received. And so I would sit in the parking lot of every church and say, God, give me an undefended heart and let me be generous in love. Because if I went in defended, right? If I went in defended, they would be defended and there would be conflict. If I went in undefended and could receive their anxiety, their anger, that would get spent, right? And then we can build relationship together. And I did have places where people were really, really angry. One place I was under the threat of physical violence, and I had to leave quickly. And I confess, I carry PTSD from that experience. I cannot go through that town It's a main thoroughfare into the mountains. I can't. I have to do some back roads because of what I experienced. But knowing, and here's the thing, when people are also love-starved, and so, I went to every person and shook their hand and asked their name and just loved on them because people are so starved. We are so miserly with our love. And people want more of that, and they begin to trust it. So the scuttlebutt all through this region was, if you want to keep hating on the bishop, don't meet her.
No, I love that. I'm curious, in particular, maybe we could focus on, because I think most of us don't have that same experience of going, chapel to chapel and meeting so many different people, but the experiences we find ourselves in are very, focused in our own families often. And, for a lot of people, I think their families, don't see things the way they do. And this can happen across a variety of different reasons. But how do you handle these? And, often, physical violence is not in play. It's more these relationships, and connection. When you encounter someone with whom you have what Aubrey called earlier, a values-based disagreement, it's not just superficial. It's not we have the same goal in different ways of getting there, but there's something that is truly there is a chasm to cross. How do you stay in relationship with those people? How do you gather at the same table? How do you forge connection when there are fundamental parts of our souls and identities that see something really differently from someone else?
And I want to say there's a difference between values and personhood, right? I value something, but when you're talking about forcing someone to deny their personhood or telling them that their personhood is invalid, that's very different. And what happens is the value of human dignity gets lost. And we have to be careful and protect ourselves in those things. When I came out to my mother, she had a heart attack, literally. Don't tell your folks it'll kill them. It almost killed her. And, because she was heartbroken, right? All the dreams she had for me, who she thought I was, suddenly she was grief-stricken. And I had to give her space. I give thanks to Oprah Winfrey, and I know some of you won't get this reference, but Phil Donahue, who would have homosexuals on TV. And my mother saw that these were people who had happy lives, and it helped her come to a different place. And so sometimes we have to let surrogates do that work for us. But we can't compromise on who we are and how we intend to live our lives as faithful Christians.
So what's coming up to me is that there needs to be a balance, it sounds like, with this idea of an undefended heart is so beautiful, but it can't mean necessarily always putting ourselves in positions of complete vulnerability. There are moments, it sounds like, where we need to be aware that something might truly be too harmful or too difficult. Is that,
I think every person needs to recognize when the hurt will harm. Conflict is a part of every relationship. And I really believe when we work through conflict, we're both transformed, right? It's not, I want you to believe like me. If I want you to really meet me where I am, I have to meet you where you are, and we both will change. And I think that's what we forget. There's a mutuality in working through conflict. And there's times when the attacks, the inability to hold another's dignity requires us to step back, I think.
I think there are a lot of allies in this room, of course. And I wonder if, I would love for you to talk about privilege a little bit. And there are places where, for Tim and for me, that maybe it's not our personhood that is at risk at the table. How do you think about that? Are there things that you would like to see people being aware of and checking about themselves and their own privilege that might be actually a tool that they can use in spaces that might not work for everybody?
Right. Well, you as a straight couple have access to places that we who are LGBTQIA plus don't have. And so you have a voice, but you have to stay in relationship with us to know our stories enough to carry them with as the precious gifts they are to you so that you can share them with others. And so to use that privilege to open the doors further. And I mean, I'm a white, educated, middle-class person. And that gives me some privilege. And so how do I use that to make space for people of color, for people who aren't like me? And so that's what you have to do. How do you make space so that I'm not the only one transmitting the message? I'm allowing people to have their own voice in that space that they wouldn't have if I wasn't there creating the space.
Please go.
Okay, one more question about this, because I think my experience has often been, and you write a little bit about this, and I thought it was so interesting because I've seen this, that sometimes in places where there really is scarcity, like where there's not enough of something really important, sometimes what feels like happens is that it's easy to start fighting with each other, ironically. Like, even though we may have the same goals, it feels like when there's scarcity, there's something about the tension that is just increased, and it's easy to start critiquing other methods, like other people who are working in different ways. And I think that's a pattern that seems to sort of pop up. And so I'd love to just hear how you think about that. Like when you see someone whose efforts don't look like yours, how do you think about it? And how do you remind yourself that you're still connected to these people who have the same intentions and who are trying to create community in the same space?
You had several things in there, so I'm going to try to unpeel that a little. First, I want to talk about scarcity. We are raised in a culture where we're told there's not enough. We don't have enough things. There's not enough to go around. And so when we get something, we hold on to it too tightly. There is enough for everyone, and that includes rights. And so, if we're gay or lesbian, we better be making room for our trans siblings, for our intersex siblings, for our asexual siblings. We must. James Forbes said, you don't go anywhere in this Christian life unless you're bringing someone along with you. And so and the more we help everyone have a seat at the table, the better the party, right? The better the party. And in fact, you've been playing at this table. You've got to play the video. Because you'll get it. Anyways, so there's enough. So then the other question was if people's, when you're chipping away at oppression, you need people at every level chipping away. And so the thing is, for me, are we doing it with great love? And the methods or means might be different, but if we're all doing it with great love, that rock will wear away. And we have to find that common ground to support each other.
In talking with many of my LGBTQ friends, it's for many people, it's an incredibly painful thing to be on the other side of someone's agenda. For someone to, like you said, invalidate who you are in some way. And I want to acknowledge that pain. And I think, of course, there can then be a dynamic that's created where, having been on the other side of someone's agenda, it would be really nice if they would change. If they would be, in relationship differently or think somewhat differently. And so there's a dynamic that emerges in which both parties want the other person to change. I'm so curious, and that can be such a difficult place to be, and almost impossible for a relationship. I mean, I would say it's probably safe to say impossible for a relationship to thrive in that scenario. Is it possible to go into relationship hoping that someone else changes in a particular way? And I'm really not sure of the answer here. I don't want to call it just an agenda, because it can be it can be really important to the relationship that someone sees something differently.
My experience has been, there were times when I didn't want anything to do with people who felt there was no place in the church for queer folk. And I was put on a committee that had the breadth of expression, people like me, and then people who felt like people like me shouldn't be in the church. And we were supposed to find a way forward. And so we, of course, we're good Methodists. We start with structure. And we realized, no, that's not going to work. We're just going to sit and talk. We're going to talk about the things that formed us, how we first came to understand our own sexuality, because everybody comes to that place. But most straight people don't get to talk about it because it's like the roadmap you're on and you're driving it and, okay, now I'm dating, And we just started to talk, and we talked for 2 years. And we were all transformed by that, and we created a community. People who were watching us do this work couldn't believe it. It's like, wait, Karen, you're sitting with him, and he's sitting with you, and we love each other, right? We learn to love each other. So I think it's possible. It's not a quick fix, but it is about starting to tell stories so that we could trust each other, and really see the not just the humanity, but the divinity in each person. Jim?
I love that story because I think that especially when I'm feeling some like anger or just intense emotion, I want to argue. And so that story was so interesting because that's not what it was. Like, it really was just this, it was like beside the point. And what was happening is that you were cultivating genuine relationships while you had all these disagreements. And it reminds me of, we talk a lot about Jonathan Haidt, and he kind of has he explains this theory that we're not persuaded actually by logical reasoning arguments. Like, we're sort of led by our hearts, and then we make it make sense. We back it up with our logic. And your story was such a beautiful illustration of that you created such genuine relationships that those things stopped being the only thing that you could see about each other. But so I'd love for you to just talk about what that looks like in church, like in a community that has come together because of faith, where like sometimes those issues feel more front and center because it's part of what brings you together in the first place. And how do you have genuine connection, not like superficial connection? Because I think that's an easy way to, and maybe sometimes necessary way to be in relationship, where it just stays very surface level and you never learn about these stories because it feels too risky. How do you do that and have real relationships without like always coming back to the issues that you disagree on?
I have so appreciated learning more about the LDS over these last 2 days. It's been fascinating to see both the similarities and the great differences. So excuse my ignorance so I'm going to start from a very methocentric, because your daughter had nerds, and I get tons of, the candy nerds. I get tons of them because I announced to the United Methodist Church when I got to preach, which was like the first time an openly queer bishop got to preach to the entire church. I opened with, yes, it's true. I am openly a metho nerd. And everybody was like, because I love the United Methodist Church, and so I get lots of nerds. Anyways, I think we have gotten away in the church from the deep soul work that we're supposed to do. We have become so structurally focused, so rule-based, that we forget that we're talking about souls and that the Holy Spirit is pretty wild moving in our souls and in our common life. And we don't want that chaos. But, oh my gosh, that's where the gifts are. And so how do we spend more time together without agendas, but a willingness to share the deep stuff going on in our lives? How do we bring that into the worship experience? I don't know about you, but we've got We used to do testimony, right? Someone would get up and say, let me tell you what God did in my life. And I was pastor of a 12,000 member church in San Francisco where we did that. You know, sex workers would talk about it. Drug addicts would talk about how God was at work in their life. And everyone was changed by that. Well, we've got to get back to that. So somehow we need to create these spaces of, enjoying a meal together and just being real.
For so long, you've been involved with an institution. Your life has been interwoven largely with an institution that, as you said, at times has explicitly rejected at least a part, of who you are. I'm curious if you've struggled, over the course of your life to sort of differentiate between God and the church, and how your conception of God has evolved, if it has, over time.
I really find that the church is where I learned about God and developed a relationship with God. The church's anti-LGBT rules didn't impact that relationship. In fact, in many ways, it strengthened it because I knew the fallibility of the institution because it's made up of people like me. And I have something I want to share at the end that will explain more of that. I do love the United Methodist way. Like people say, why do you stay? Right? How many people ask you, why do you stay? Because it gave me my pathway to God. The spirituality of the church resonates with my soul work. The rules may not, but the spirituality and theology does, and it's home. And let me look at the United Church of Christ. Let me look at the Episcopal Church. No, they don't help me thrive in the love of God that even with its bad theology or its bad rules that it had for so long, the United Methodist Church still did. So it still nurtured me. Did I ever think about leaving? Oh yeah. I looked at another church and interviewed. I thought about, wow, wouldn't it be nice to work at Macy's? A 9-to-5 job and a discount on clothes. But I realized that wasn't my call. I was called to be a United Methodist pastor.
Will you see just a little bit about, you mentioned just for a second, this ministry of vomit. And I recognize that this really was a call for you, but that feels like something that we can each participate in our own sphere of influence. Can you just talk about what that has looked like, or if you have a particular story that comes to mind?
So, I was a pastor for 27 years in San Francisco. You cannot be in a more secularized city. And if I wore a clerical collar, I'd show up to protests and demonstrations or, places where I needed a collar. People would do a double take because, one person said to me, "That's a great costume. Where did you get it?" Because in San Francisco, we like to dress up. But when I said, I'm a United Methodist pastor, all the hurt that the church had put on people, all the wounds would be like, and people would start talking about it, and because I represented that for them. But unless they vomited that up, there could be no healing. As long as that pain was within them, and there was no one to catch that and to witness it and say, I'm sorry. And the thing is, I could go home and take a shower, right? But I knew I left people a little bit more whole and a little bit more hopeful than they were before.
They're I think there are times in everyone's life when they're the person called to receive the vomit, and at other times that they are the ones that need to vomit. Could you talk about, just briefly, some principles for looking for a safe person to receive that? For the people who are feeling like they are at a point where they just need to let some things out.
I'll talk about me. I mean, yeah, I needed a place to vomit. You know, it wasn't easy being where I was. Early on, well, I've had a therapist, I've had a coach, I've had a spiritual director, I've had a personal trainer. I took up boxing. I love it. It was a great way to get those feelings out. But I also knew I needed trusted soul friends where I could vomit. And there were several of us. I was the only bishop, but there were several other queer folk in high leadership levels in the Methodist Church, some closeted, some not. And we would meet once a week on Zoom. We still do. And we get to vomit together and pray for each other. And even if we've only met in person twice. And it's sustained me through all the hard stuff I had to go through as a bishop.
Thank you for that. And that really does feel like the opportunity of this weekend, and maybe maybe that is also a place where you find that you can find those people in your faith community. And so I love that idea of just like always trying to come back to the table to find your people.
And we're doing it for each other, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, I'm going to vomit on you and then I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to sit here and hold your vomit.
We got to let go of either the vomit or the table metaphor. I think we need to start wrapping up. I would love for you to, will you just do that reading?
Yeah.
To take us out?
I was so moved yesterday. I'm going to start to cry. I'm so moved by the stories that were shared and the conversations I was a part of where I overheard a lot. And I see you, and I know what it's like to be in a church that doesn't know what to do with us. And every day for years, I read this, and it came up in my prayers this morning as I was thinking about our time. This is by Carlo Coretta, who is an Italian lay brother who loved the Roman Catholic Church, and it also brought him his greatest pain. So this is what I want to gift you with. How baffling you are, O Church, and yet how I love you. How you've made me suffer, and yet how much I owe you. I'd like to see you destroyed, and yet I need your presence. You've given me so much scandal, and yet you've made me understand what sanctity is. I've seen nothing in the world more devoted to obscurity, more compromised, more false. And yet I've touched nothing more pure, more generous, more beautiful. How often I've wanted to shut the doors of my soul in your face, and how often I've prayed to die in the safety of your arms. No, I can't free myself from you, because I am you, though not completely. And besides, where would I go? Would I establish another? I wouldn't be able to establish it without the same faults, for they are the same faults I carry in me. And if I did establish another, it would be my church, not the Church of Christ. I'm old enough to know that I'm no better than anyone else.
Thank you so much.
It's a perfect place to end. Thank you.
You're awesome.